The world stopped for David 40 years ago. It stopped with the doctor's sterile voice delivering a 6-month sentence. The world mourned. Tributes were paid, tears flowed. A gap opened in the lives of those who loved him. A space that slowly, painstakingly, began to heal and fill with the shape of absence. Eleanor built a life in that space. She married Mark, David's best friend, a man who'd been a rock in the shattering aftermath. They had children, careers, shared laughter, and quiet evenings. But the space where David had been never truly closed. It was a scar tissue deep in her heart, a phantom limb of a future lost. Mark, too, carried the weight. He'd seen Eleanor's devastation, felt the raw edge of his own grief, and the quiet responsibility of stepping into the void David left. He'd always lived a little in David's shadow, the charismatic, brilliant one. And the shadow, even in absence, was long. Sarah, David's younger sister, never quite recovered. The big brother who promised to protect her, who made the world feel safe, simply vanished. Her anxiety, a low hum before, became a constant, crippling drone, making relationships and simple daily tasks feel monumental. Then, 30 years after the eulogies, 40 years after the diagnosis that should have claimed him, David walked back into their lives. It wasn't a grand entrance. It was a Tuesday morning. Eleanor was in her garden, trimming roses, the sun warm on her back. Mark was at work. Sarah was attempting to leave her apartment for a therapy appointment. A car she didn't recognize pulled up to Eleanor's curb. A man got out. He was thinner than she remembered, lines etched around his eyes, hair gray at the temples. But it was him, unmistakably him. Eleanor dropped the secateur. They clattered against the flagstone path. David, the name was a ghost on her tongue. He just stood there, a suitcase at his feet, looking utterly lost and overwhelmed, like a deep-sea diver surfacing in thin air. Eleanor. His voice was raspy, unfamiliar, yet the timbre sent shivers down her spine. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief, shock, and a raw, confusing pain that ripped open old wounds. News spread like wildfire through their small town. The man who died was alive. Mark was the first to confront him, cornering David on Eleanor's porch. David, what the hell? His voice was low, vibrating with 30 years of buried anger and confusion. We buried you. We grieved. Eleanor, he trailed off, the unspoken weight of his marriage to her hanging heavy in the air. David flinched as if struck. I know. Mark, he looked away, unable to meet his friend's gaze. It wasn't. I couldn't. Couldn't what? Mark demanded, stepping closer. Pick up a phone? Send a letter? Let us know you weren't in the ground? Do you have any idea what we went through? His face was contorted, a mirror of the silent suffering he'd endured. He thought he was over it. But a volcano of grief, responsibility, and resentment erupted with terrifying force. His anxiety, usually managed, flared into full-blown panic attacks. Eleanor was quieter, her pain a cold, sharp ache. She watched David with a clinical detachment that masked a storm of conflicting emotions. Grief for the young man she'd loved wrestled with anger at the man who had caused her so much pain. Where were you, David? She asked one evening, her voice flat. They were sitting in her living room, the room where they had once planned a future that never happened. 30 years. We thought you were dead. We knew you were dead. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. It was complicated. The diagnosis was real, Eleanor. Terminal. 6 months was generous. But you're here, she said, the absurdity of it all hitting her again. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. An opportunity arose. An experimental treatment. Desperate times it required complete isolation. No contact. For years. They said maybe a few years. It stretched. His explanation was vague, frustratingly thin. He offered no details, no names, no locations. It felt like another evasion, another abandonment. Sarah's reaction was the most fragile. When she finally agreed to see him, she stood across the room, trembling, unable to get closer. Is it really you? She whispered, tears welling in her anxious eyes. You left. You just disappeared. I thought I thought it was my fault somehow. The abandonment she'd felt had festered into a deep-seated belief that she was fundamentally unlovable, that anyone she got close to would eventually leave. David's return, while a shock, didn't instantly heal this. It merely brought the old wound to the surface, raw and weeping. Her therapy sessions became focused entirely on him, reliving the trauma of his supposed death and the confusing reality of his presence. David's presence became a disruptive force, a ghost refusing to stay in its grave. The community buzzed with speculation. Lawyers were involved. He'd been declared legally dead. His assets, his life, had been distributed, absorbed. Now what? Beyond the legal mess, the emotional and psychological fallout was immense. Mark found himself battling a corrosive jealousy he hadn't anticipated. He'd built his life on the foundation of David's absence. David's return threatened not just his past narrative of grieving friend and supportive husband, but his present reality. He questioned Eleanor's feelings, doubted her love, and his anger at David masked a deeper fear of losing everything he had built. His relationship with Eleanor grew strained, their shared history of mourning David now a source of tension rather than connection. His sleep became erratic, plagued by nightmares. Eleanor struggled to reconcile the young man she'd loved with a haunted stranger before her. Her grief, which she thought had calcified into acceptance, felt fresh and agonizing. She found herself questioning her marriage, her choices, the validity of the life she had built on a premise that turned out to be false. The mental exhaustion was immense, the constant battle between anger, hurt, and a flicker of the old affection. She started having panic attacks again, something she hadn't experienced in years. Sarah's anxiety reached a fever pitch. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every interaction with David felt like walking a tightrope. She craved his reassurance, but feared his inevitable departure. She saw him not just as a brother, but as an embodiment of her deepest fears, abandonment and instability. Her therapist noted a significant regression in her progress. David, meanwhile, carried his own immense burden. The isolation hadn't just been physical. 30 years of living on borrowed time, of being cut off from the world, had left him profoundly scarred. He suffered from chronic insomnia, flashbacks to the sterile, controlled environment he'd inhabited, and a pervasive sense of detachment. He was acutely aware of the pain he had caused, the lives he had irrevocably altered, and the guilt was a crushing weight. He had survived, but at what cost? He hadn't just been living. He'd been enduring, suspended in a state of medical limbo, the fear of recurrence a constant shadow. He found it almost impossible to connect the deep emotional bonds he'd once shared, feeling like distant memories belonging to another person. His attempt to explain, however inadequate, were met with suspicion and hurt. How could he possibly convey the psychological toll of 3 decades of enforced solitude? He felt like a ghost in his own life, watching others live the future he was supposed to have. One rain-swept afternoon, the truth, or at least a larger piece of it, began to surface. David, pushed by Eleanor's quiet insistence and Mark's volatile anger, revealed more about the experimental treatment. It wasn't just isolation. It was a brutal regime of therapies, monitored constantly, in a facility that prioritized results over human connection. There were setbacks, near-death experiences, even within the treatment. Contact was forbidden not just for medical reasons, but perhaps also for legal or ethical ones. The treatment was experimental, its success not guaranteed, its methods potentially questionable by outside standards. He had been, in essence, a test subject. He had signed away his rights, his identity, for a chance at life. And when the treatment finally concluded years later than anticipated, he was left with a new set of problems: re-entry. How do you return to a world that thinks you're dead? How do you explain 3 lost decades? Fear, guilt, and a profound sense of alienation had kept him away. He had watched from a distance initially, seen them move on, and the idea of disrupting their hard-won peace felt crueler than staying hidden. This revelation was not a magic bomb. It explained what happened, but not why he didn't try later or the full extent of his suffering. It added layers of complexity and pain. Mark's anger shifted slightly, tinged with a grudging pity, but the betrayal remained. Eleanor's detachment cracked, revealing a deep well of sorrow for the ordeal he must have faced, but also resentment for the years of mourning she could have been spared. Sarah, hearing of his suffering, felt a pang of empathy, but the fear of abandonment didn't simply vanish. The climax arrived during a tense, emotional gathering at Eleanor's house. All three of them were there, the air thick with unspoken accusations and raw feelings. Mark, fueled by anxiety and unresolved anger, lashed out, detailing the years of struggle, the grief that had shaped their lives, the nights he'd held Eleanor while she cried for a dead man. Eleanor, finally breaking her composed facade, tearfully laid bare her own pain. The years of therapy, the fear of loving again, the fundamental shift in her understanding of life and loss. Sarah, trembling but finding a fragile strength, spoke of the crippling anxiety, the feeling of being left behind, of never feeling safe. David listened, his face etched with agony. He didn't offer excuses, only broken apologies and fragmented glimpses into the dark, lonely years he had spent. He spoke of the fear, the pain, the desperate hope that kept him going, and the crushing weight of realizing how much time had passed, how impossible return felt. He revealed the twist. The treatment wasn't a complete cure, but a precarious remission. He still had chronic health issues, the threat of recurrence a constant specter. He hadn't just endured physical trials. The prolonged isolation and trauma had left him with complex PTSD and a profound difficulty reconnecting emotionally. His survival was a medical miracle, but a psychological burden. The truth hung in the air, heavy and heartbreaking. There was no easy forgiveness, no magical mending of broken bonds. The ending wasn't a neat resolution, but a fragile beginning. Mark and Eleanor had confronted the reality of their marriage, built partly on shared grief for David. Could they navigate this new landscape? Mark had to grapple with his anger and jealousy, finding a way to accept David's presence without feeling diminished. Eleanor had to decide if she could forgive, if the past could ever truly be integrated into the present. Sarah, seeing David's own fragility, his own scars, began the long, arduous process of reframing her abandonment. He hadn't left because she wasn't enough. He had left for his own desperate battle for survival, a battle that had also broken him in its own way. It didn't erase the pain, but it offered a different perspective, a chance to begin healing her deep-seated anxiety. David's future was uncertain. He carried the weight of his absence and the trauma of his survival. Reintegration was a monumental task. He needed therapy, support, a way to build a new life in a world that had moved on without him. The legacy of those lost 30 years was not just the pain he had caused, but the profound, complex ways in which it had shaped every single one of them. The story ended not with joyous reunion, but with a tentative, difficult step towards understanding. David was alive, a testament to resilience, but also a reminder of the unpredictable cruelty of life and the deep, lasting impact of trauma, both on those who leave and those who are left behind. The space he had left open for 30 years wouldn't be filled. It would remain a scar, a story, a testament to a past that refused to be buried in the long, complex journey of healing the human mind.